Get started. Sorry for the delay. As we speak, we missed one panelist already, but you know, the good thing is you have 4 of us here. Wang Yiping might or might not join us, but the good thing is the show goes on, and we're going to start right away. So this is a session on Asia. And it's kind of interesting because when you're in Asia now, everybody asks about Europe. Is Europe collapsing? What are you doing with energy? Why do you have inflation? You know, and when you're here, everybody asks you, is China collapsing? You know, how come the rest of Asia is not collapsing because China is collapsing? So I think this session should bring a little bit of light to these two kind of opposing realities. And we're going to focus on the idea of Asia's outlook, but with the economic security angle, as well as this potential fragmentation. This is all about bifurcation, but beyond bifurcation, because bifurcation could be easy for Asia, just, you know, Asia on one side, Europe and the West, or the rest of the West. But where does Japan lie? Or South Korea? Or Indonesia? Chatib may tell us in a minute. So, you know, I think it's interesting to see that Asia is becoming a much more complex, multipolar reality for us in Europe. So that's the aim of this panel. Without further ado, I'm going to start shooting questions to the panelists. They better be ready for this one. We're going to be very fast, and we want to have as many questions from you as possible and from the audience online. So the first, let's start with, since we're an economic think tank, we're going to start with an economic outlook from Frederick Neumann from HSBC. We've sat together very long in Hong Kong. I think he's really wonderfully placed to tell us why don't we have inflation in parts of Asia, and also what are the central banks doing? They look pretty relaxed compared to others. How come? I mean, we have tapering in mind. Maybe Chatib can talk about that later, but let's start with Frederick for 3 to 5 minutes. Thank you, Frederick.
Yes, good morning, and thank you, Alicia. Good morning, everybody. Indeed, it's a picture of resilience if you think about Asia in many ways. We have high energy prices. We had a pandemic. Asia faced many of these headwinds that other parts of the world face as well. But we are here really at a point where most Asian economies, China accepted, really show a picture of resilience. And Alicia, you mentioned inflation. Perhaps that is a good angle to take, because unlike other economies, notably the US and of course Europe as well, we haven't seen the same degree of inflation pressures develop, and that allows really central banks to take a much more measured approach, and therefore you don't see as big a disruption as you see in other parts of the world, perhaps. Now, why is inflation lower? There are a number of reasons for this. By and large, one important aspect is we didn't have the same degree of fiscal transfers to households. So Asian governments haven't really provided as much support to consumers during the pandemic. And that means that consumers didn't have the same degree of spending power coming out of the pandemic. And therefore, consumer spending is accelerating much more gradually. In the US, famously, we had the checks that were in the mail by the government. In Europe, you have a lot of social security assistance, unemployment support. In Asia, that support is much, much lower. A second big reason why we have lower inflation in Asia is really the flexibility of the labor market. In many Asian economies, the informal labor market is still very large, and we don't like informal labor markets because, of course, that means less protection for workers, but it also means, in fact, that you have much more flexibility, and that then also reduces wage pressures that, of course, plaguing other economies as well. And then the last point I would make is the degree of subsidies. A number of economies have had subsidies, and that helped to keep energy prices lower, for example. It helped keep even food prices lower in some economies, and that helped to cushion things as well. Although it hastens to say that on this last aspect of subsidies, they're not really that sustainable. And of course, in Indonesia, we just had the announcement that there'll be a pruning of subsidies, which will release some inflation pressures with the lag. But since I mentioned Indonesia, Alicia, perhaps that's a segue to Chatib.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Frederick. So we're going to have Chatip Basri, former finance minister of Indonesia, and a wonderful economist. I know Chatip has lots to tell us about G20, but also about that difference. Yeah, I mean, Chatip was indeed at a very difficult time finance minister. This was tapering times. So how different is it, Chatip, from those times in Indonesia and beyond in Asia? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Good morning, all distinguished participants. It is a great pleasure to be here. So perhaps let me respond to your question, why this current situation is different than what we had back on 2013, for example, regarding the tapering. It is very interesting if you look at the composition of the current account condition in many developing economies, not only in Asia, but in many emerging markets. Most of the developing economies are running current account surplus, including, or if they run a current account deficit, was relatively small. And one of the reasons behind it, because the pandemic, interestingly, increased the private saving, because people, reduced the consumption during the pandemic, so the saving increased. This have an implication for the lower current account deficit or even the current account surplus. So because of this current account situation, fortunately, it did not create a sort of like nervousness to the market. That's explained why the current situation is different compared to 2013. The other issue, I think, the Fed learned, unfortunately, in a very hard way about how to communicate with the developing emerging economies at that time. So if you recall from the beginning, Chair Powell from the beginning said that he will continue to communicate to emerging economies. So most of the investors were basically prepared for this. They learned from the taper tantrum situation. The other plausible explanation, especially a country like Indonesia, the share of foreign ownership to their total government bond is relatively low compared to what they had back on 2013, for example. Like in the case of Indonesia, during my time, Alicia, if you recall, the share of the foreign ownership to the government bond was around 40%. So when the Fed raised the interest rate, immediately, emerging market collapsed. But nowadays it's only about 16% because most of the money left the emerging developing economies, Asian countries, during the early of the pandemic. So that is why we didn't really see a sort of like so much impact. So looking at this current situation, I'm not too worried so much about the repetition of the taper tantrum, but I do have some concerns related to Asian countries. If you look at the growth outlook, I completely agree with Frederick. Asian countries are relatively resilient, but there are a couple of issues that we need to look at more carefully. The first one is the issue of this rising inequality, the K-shaped recovery. And I think this is not only unique in Asian countries, but also even in Europe or in the US. The second issue is about the impact to the vulnerable groups due to the high energy and also the food prices. We can discuss about it, what the G20 can do related to it. And the third issue is also about the impact to, Frederick mentioned about, we are lucky to have this informal labor market, but the implication of the pandemic, they hit people who doesn't have the social protection during the pandemic. So Asian countries are facing challenge that probably their future of their fiscal policy should go into the inclusive growth. And this will require fiscal expansion. But at the same time, if we see what happened in the developed economies, they need to withdraw the stimulus. So the challenge is how to recalibrate, how to find the right time to exit the stimulus. Because the developed countries probably they need to do it now, whereas some Asian countries probably they need to do it later. So this is the role of the G20, I believe, will become very important. We can discuss it about it later on. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you, Chatrip. I really like your point on increasing income inequality, and I know you're pushing very hard to include inclusivity issues at the G20. We can talk about that later, but I think it's a very, very important weakness, which not only Asia has, but I have to say all over the world, and high energy prices only make it worse. So on that note, we're going to move ahead towards Françoise Nicolas from IFRI, long-term actually expert on Asia. I'm very proud to have experts like Françoise in Europe on Asia. And I want to move a little bit towards the elephant in the room, which is economic security, or outright national security in Asia, because as we speak, it would all look like a nice boat, floating, but we know that it's, China, US strategic competition on the one hand, and actually rising powers. Yeah, we have India, we have Indonesia. How is Asia coping with this new reality, Françoise?
Okay, well, I'm not sure I can answer this question right away, but to connect this issue of economic security with the current circumstances, what we have seen over the past few years is a combination of a number of issues, a number of problems. First, we had, this underlying rising Sino-US rivalry. That's the backdrop to everything that happened. On top of that, we got the pandemic. And the combination of these two events led to the realization that globalization was actually not all that virtuous, that there were drawbacks to globalization, that globalization leading to interdependence was or could be a problem. And so it had to do with very tight connections between economies. So once one economy is hit, the others also become hit by a problem. And this was quite obvious with the pandemic. But on top of that, due to the Sino-US rivalry, this interdependence could be weaponized. So it's the combination of vulnerabilities associated with interdependence and the potential weaponization of this interdependence that led to the realization that economic security had to be factored in, that all the economic calculations that were based exclusively on cost efficiency were to some extent wrong. So you had to factor in this additional notion of economic security. And that creates, of course, a number of issues, a number of problems, and a number of different choices or different options. And in Asia, what we see, in Southeast Asia in particular, what we see are, negative impacts of these new conditions, as well as positive impacts. The reason being that since China is today in a difficult situation, what we observe are a number of relocations away from China to Southeast Asia. And this is true for Western companies, Japanese companies, but this is also true to some extent for Chinese companies. Yeah. So some Chinese companies actually leave China and relocate in Southeast Asia because the conditions there, production conditions, are better. And through these relocations, they can also avoid, to some extent, the Sino-US rivalry. They can go around the problem. So what we see as a result is a reorganization of the production networks in this part of the world, but not necessarily in a negative way. Far to the contrary, Southeast Asia is actually, to some extent, a beneficiary of this reorganization. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but I think that we see a number of very complicated things happening at the same time, but all of them are related to economic security and the way this economic security issue or equation is solved. So much for my answer.
Thank you, Françoise. I think only this issue would bring us to one more panel on the side, if you want, during coffee time. In fact, it's quite interesting to see FDI data. We don't have so recent full FDI data, but we do have M&A data. And it so happens that since mid-2021, which coincides with the sharp deceleration of the Chinese economy and many other issues we could get into, especially Juan Yiping joins the meeting. And if not, we'll surely cover it somehow. But we see M&A into China plummeting, and very, very fast increase in M&A deals into Australia from Europe, into ASEAN from the US, and into India from everybody. So that's kind of what we see in the data. And that's that kind of dichotomy that I'd like to follow up on in the second round, which is really this interesting idea. Frankly speaking, for years we've been saying if China sneezes, well, Asia catches pneumonia, maybe the rest of the world, catches, I don't know, the cold. But for Asia, we always thought that if China were to grow 2%, the rest of Asia could not, certainly ASEAN, could not withstand that shock. But that's not what we see in the data. PMIs in Asia are doing great, and China's data is simply horrible. So had we overestimated the spillovers? Is it because there's this reshuffling that François has just talked about, that in a way they are beneficiaries of their own sake, of China's own sake in a way? I think that's an interesting topic for Europe, because we tend to pack the whole of Asia together, but we are seeing as we speak that's not what's happening. So on that note, perhaps what I like to hear, maybe we start again, same order with Frédéric, is this idea of where is China heading, Frédéric? And also, what is it in for us? Because beyond the very poor growth figures, imports from China have been growing at barely 1% average since the pandemic started. It's slightly more and then coming down to 1% or so. So that's very little for the rest of the world. So what can the rest of the world expect from China for the rest of the year and possibly after the Party Congress? Thank you.
Well, it's not a secret to say that China is facing severe economic headwinds. There are three really big headwinds on the domestic side. The first one is we have to acknowledge we're in a political transition year, and that usually tends to impair the stimulus measure that Beijing tries to apply, because at many local government levels, the mayor is moving seats. And so that reduces the ability for Beijing to really revive economic growth. The second big headwind is the real estate market, where the government deliberately last year tried to squeeze out the speculative excesses. And now, of course, that has turned into a major, major headwind for the economy. And then you also have the zero COVID policy still. That's a major constraint on consumer spending and services. Now, all of these three forces together will likely lead to economic growth this year coming well under the economic growth target of the government. The question, of course, is when can we expect a reacceleration? And probably these three factors will take time to dissipate. The political transition will not be over until the second quarter of next year. The government is unlikely to remove any restrictions on the real estate market imminently, so that will take probably another few quarters before we see stabilization there. And then also on the zero COVID policy, they are nudging towards an exit, but it will take time to see that recovery come through. And that means a meaningful recovery for China, possibly only second half of next year, when we get back to growth rates that are coming anywhere close to what we saw in the good old days. But even then, the medium-term outlook for China is no longer that heady growth, perhaps more in the range of 4 to 5% than 5 to 6%. And that's the new reality. Now, what's the impact on the rest of the world? It is a disinflationary impulse at this moment of time. It restrains commodity prices. It restrains global demand. It means that China is churning out goods to the world economy. Steel exports, for example, are surging out of China because China doesn't have their own demand domestically. And that helps to restrain actually inflation in some parts of Asia and maybe even the world overall. Is that a growth headwind for the rest of the world? Of course. China is the second largest economy in the world. And that means that if the US were to buckle, if we see growth tumbling other parts of the world, there's very little safety net for the world economy. And therefore, at the moment, it appears as if we're not affected by China's slowdown. But I would caution against this view. I would argue that we're seeing still resilient growth elsewhere in the world that helps to kind of gloss over China's weakness, but we should be careful here. If we see a recession potentially in the US, that would amplify the drag from China. And therefore, as Chachi mentioned, there are still risks out there for Asian economies, and those would be a global recession in which China plays a very important part. So a kind of a cautious outlook. I think some of the headlines on China's collapse or financial crisis are well overdone. But it is a cyclically challenging outlook that will remain with us for several quarters to come.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Frederic. Absolutely. It's too early to just dispel the idea of spillovers from China's economic weakness. And we need to realize that the rest of the world is not doing great either. So, that amplifies, I think it's an important point you made. I want to go back to Chatrip on basically his wonderful knowledge about what's going on in the G20, which I'm sure is interesting for all of us, but also in the light of comments I've heard you making right there, actually in Indonesia only a day ago, 24 hours ago, so on the idea of scarring. I mean, because so far we've painted a nice picture about the rest of Asia. I mean, it seems to be doing well, notwithstanding China's weakness, and all of that is fine. I hope we've not lost our speakers. Should I worry or should I not worry? Okay, that's great. Okay, you're back. Great. So, Chatrip, the question then is, how big is the scarring? I mean, because, we cyclically, we're okay, as I said, and basically there was a lot of pent-up demand after, especially Delta, and last year at this time it was a horrible time for Southeast Asia. So I guess the good things now come as a little bit of a pent-up demand issue, but we still have the scarring. We still have huge scarring from COVID, and I'd like to hear from you first, what are the prospects? Second, what can the G20 do about it?
Well, thank you very much, Alicia. But before I respond to the issue of the scattering effect, let me add one point related to your question to Frederick, if you don't mind. Yeah, I completely agree with Frederick. I think in the case of the spillover, negative spillover effect of China to Asian countries, probably this will take some time, because in the case of Indonesia, for example, one of the reasons why we maintain relatively high growth, because we are lucky thanks to the high commodity and energy prices, because 60% of our export is energy commodity related. But once the US recession take place, then will affect Europe and China. Then later on, it will affect the Asian countries as well. Now, let me try to respond to your question. I think this issue is really serious. So let me give an example. Yeah, I was talking about the risk of the setback of the quality of the human capital. During the pandemic, based on the study conducted by the Asian Development Bank, there were around 27% of the population in ASEAN did not have access for the distant learning due to the bad quality of this digital infrastructure. So this digital divide really have an impact about the quality of the human capital, because maybe some part in some countries, they were not able to sort of like to catch up or even to get the facility for the education in the last 2 years. And this impact we may see probably 10 years or 15 years from now, because the last 2 years. And if you're talking about the implication of these vulnerable groups, I'm not talking only about the poor, but I'm talking also about the vulnerable groups, someone that above the poverty line, but because they couldn't do their activities during the pandemic, they're trapped into poverty. Yeah, I agree that it is true that the economic is recovering, but this will take some time for these people.
We might get
consumption household, for example.
Yes.
That is why, in my view, the design of the fiscal policy still need to continue with the inclusive growth. And then, under this kind of situation, the role of the policy coordination become very crucial, because we need to discuss when will be the best time to do the stimulus under this kind of situation. But unfortunately, what we are having, the G20 at this moment, is a global tension. Yeah, the geopolitical tension. So you can imagine when the world badly need a global cooperation, what we have is actually the geopolitical tension. So under this kind of situation, I can imagine the position that Indonesia can offer as a host for the G20 is try to select issues that universally shared by all the members. Otherwise, if you're talking about this global recovery, then the issue of this war in Ukraine will pop up, right? And you cannot reach the conclusion related to that. So that is why the issue of this impact of the food security to the vulnerable groups become very important issue. The issue of climate change, in which every country would agree to sit around the table. Or the third one, interestingly, and then I think this is the good thing about the G20, the G20 was able to establish the so-called the Financial Intermediary Fund for the task force for joint finance and health. And I think if we focus on the issue of health, the issue of climate change, which is issue that universally shared by many countries, then maybe G20 can move forward. Because, Alicia, I recall when I was in the government and involved in the G20, 2008 G20 was very effective because we had a common problem at that time, the global financial crisis. Then when the global recovery was uneven, G20 became less effective. So we have to find the entry point, the common ground that everyone could sit on the table to discuss about this.
Thank you, Chatrip. Hearing you, and being with you in Bali, I can sense how difficult it is for Indonesia to sit in front of this mountain of, of a group that indeed was very useful for previous crises, and feeling that you can't move ahead. I mean, it's quite something for the world, I believe. And I think Indonesia's proposal through Chatrip that we focus on things where there's a minimum denominator, whether it's health, whether it's climate change, whether it's, of course, social issues, development, I think is well taken. But yeah, it's a humongous challenge because the global economy is also undergoing a lot of pressure. So in a way, it's going to be harder than ever. And I think that's indeed important. So on that note, I think we can swift. By the way, and I wanted to say that indeed at Rugel, Scott is here, we worked on the topic you mentioned on digitalization and access to digital services. So we are getting a blog out very soon, a report for the T20 indeed. So I want to thank Scott for all of his efforts on that side.
If I may, Alicia,
sure,
I add something on China?
Sure.
Because Frederick listed a number of headwinds for China. And I don't want to sound too pessimistic or negative, but I would like to add one headwind.
Please, the floor is yours, François. I was about to say.
Which is, by the way, even more structural than the others that were listed, and this is demography. And demography is very much against China. So it is a real issue for China, and this is a very deep structural trend. And this is something that China cannot really do anything about. So this will be a problem for China in the coming years or even decades. That's one first thing I wanted to add. And another thing I want to add is beyond headwinds, I think as external observers, what we can say about China today is that the situation there is extremely uncertain. There are a number of uncertainties, and among these uncertainties, there's one that is extremely important, I think, and which we have many difficulties understanding, and that's the change in the trade-off between ideology and pragmatism. So far, there has always been this oscillation between ideology and pragmatism, but so far, what Chinese leaders chose pragmatism. And so it was pretty easy for us to anticipate the direction of the policies, because we thought, well, they're going to be pragmatic at the end of the day. So we knew more or less what kind of decisions they would make. But today, I'm afraid that the pendulum has swung back towards ideology. And as a result, it is much more complicated to anticipate what kind of decision they will make. Because these decisions are not necessarily based on any what we perceive as rational considerations or pragmatic considerations. And so it makes things even more uncertain than in the past. So that's something I wanted to add, to inject some political dimension to the debate.
Which by now we humble economists can't do away with, you know. That basically has become our mantra, this geo-economics that we are all trying to struggle to figure out. But I wanted to add one thing, if I may, given that Yiping Huan is not here, which is based on these two key questions that everybody asks about China. A few months ago, when especially Shanghai's lockdown started, the question every client would ask is, or everybody, not only client, everybody would ask is, where's the stimulus? When are they starting? Why haven't they started yet? That was the first question. Now the question is exactly what I asked Frederick, which is, are they going to change after the Party Congress? These are the two questions. But I want to add to the first question, because it's quite important. There's two ways to understand why the stimulus isn't there, because it isn't there. One is what you just said, Françoise, is that the trade-off or the balance between pragmatism and ideology is tilted towards ideology, and just there's this entrenched view that stimulus will be distortive and blah, blah, blah. That could be one. But there is another one, is that they can't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very important, because the world has this entrenched idea that China can do it all. It's deus ex machina. But China's public debt literally is 3 times what Japan's debt was when Japan had China's income per capita. And that's without counting state-owned enterprises. If we count state-owned enterprises, China is not very far from Japan today. So, I'm just saying, where is the room? Why is the PBOC not cutting rates? Maybe it's not so easy. They have financial stability issues. The banks can't really cope without much lower rates. So what I'm saying is that beyond the trade-off, there's also some economic realities that have changed, making Chinese policymakers' attempts to jumpstart the economy much harder, let alone the fact that, of course, we have zero COVID and so on. But I was trying to say that for those who need to deal with zero COVID and try to solve it, today's solutions are much harder than past solutions. And I think that's important for all of us to know, because China won't save the rest of the world anymore. We need to take that out of our mind if we still had it somewhere in our brain. So on that note, 9:40, we're going to leave the floor to the audience. And I made a terrible mistake, which is I didn't say how to send questions through. So the code is BAM, BAM, and polarised all together for those online. So please take your time to send us some questions. There's none, but of course I didn't give you the code. So there you go, BAM, polarised all together. And for those in the audience who wants to start, yeah, oh, that's great, many hands up. So please.
My question is on the trade-off, ideology versus pragmatism. And I'm not sure that I'm no expert on China, that I would have chosen ideology as one of the sides. I would have chosen party control instead of ideology. So the one thing that to an external observer seems to obsess the Chinese political elite is party control. So my question is whether this is, and connected to that, you said that Chinese companies are resettling in Southeast Asia. And my related question is this only because of economic reasons, or also to get some degree of freedom from party control? I mean, yeah. It seems that the life of Chinese entrepreneurs is becoming more difficult. So the question is, by going to Vietnam, do they try and get some degree of freedom from this party control?
Thank you, Francesco. Just, sorry, if you can introduce yourself for those, especially online, or everybody else, actually. Yeah. We will take, what about if we take since there will be quite a few, 2 questions, and then we'll share, Robin, if you could, yeah, and if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you, Can Ercan. I'm Energy Counselor at the Turkish delegation to the EU, based in Brussels. I missed, sorry for inconvenience, I missed the first part of the session. I don't know if the speakers talk about partnership for global infrastructure and investment. It's a new, very new initiative in late June. It's a G7 initiative, and press reports say that it's an initiative to balance Chinese Belt and Road initiative. So do you believe this new initiative will increase Asian asymmetries in a polarized world? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. So we have 3 questions, 3 panelists. I'm going to move out of any answer. So Francoise, ladies first, you can pick your question.
Yeah, about this ideology versus pragmatism, or party control versus pragmatism. Well, I think that ideology does matter. I wouldn't kind of reduce the, the thing to party control. What Xi Jinping has in mind is really stability. So far, that was what he had in mind before, stability at any cost. So he was ready to compromise with communism, with whatever, and an ideology to get stability. And this is what I call pragmatism. So today what we see is that he is ready to accept lower growth, to accept some problems, just to maintain his line, his ideological line. So that's why I do insist on ideology rather than simply party control. Because party control would go together with stability, and stability is pragmatism, to my mind. So I'm not sure that this is the the trade-off. So I would tend to disagree with the way you see it. But it's an open question. I'm not in Xi Jinping's mind, so I don't know exactly what he has in mind. But that's the way I would read it. Okay. And otherwise, may I?
You can take as many.
Yeah, about relocation. Relocation of companies to Southeast Asia. Of course, there are a number of reasons behind that. I guess that the economic reasons or economic considerations prevail, but there may be other reasons. And I think in particular, the way to avoid Sino-US rivalry or US sanctions, that's also a consideration that matters in these decisions. But again, that's my own reading.
Wonderful. Frédéric, Chatip, you want to take any of these 3 questions, please?
Okay. Yeah. Oh, you want to start first, Frederick, or?
No, after you, Bapak.
Okay. Thank you. So perhaps let me try to respond about this resettling in Southeast Asia first, and then also the question about infrastructure. I think I agree with Francois. One of the reasons besides is, they try to find a sort of like a place that they can enter the US market, through the other country. That's also one of the economic reasons. Besides that, one thing that we learned from this case of the pandemic is don't put your eggs in one basket. Yeah, so when China affected is a the major source of the hub of the global supply chain. So it is very important to diversify, to reach to many Asian countries, including in Southeast Asia. So that's the first one. The second one, related to the issue of the infrastructure, I want to highlight what Francois said about the pragmatism. I think it is important to understand that we have to accept China is the second largest economy in the world now. Yeah, it is inevitable. The question is, at the given situation and also the geopolitical tension, what country can do? And this related to your question about this infrastructure, because I recall, let me share sort of like an inside story about the AIIB when it was established, a couple of years ago. Yeah. ASEAN was in a very difficult situation whether they want to join AIIB or not. But we realized that China is the second largest economy in the world. It is inevitable. So the strategy is it is better to join the AIIB and try to come up with the sort of like a good governance in order to ensure that AIIB have this gold standard like a Bretton Woods. I was hoping at the time that the big guy like United States would also join, but unfortunately didn't happen. Luckily, some European countries also joined. And why this is important? Because if the sort of like the Western countries or the advanced economies could also join, somehow they can quote unquote impose the modern system of the governance under this kind of system. Why it is important? Because the issue of AIIB is related to the some of the concern about the Belt and Road, for example, about the governance issue. Yeah. So you mentioned about this global infrastructure partnership. I think in this, if the spirit is trying to compete with the Belt and Road, I don't think that will be a sort of like a good way to address the concern about this Belt and Road. It is better to sort of like to work together. So I give an example. It is better for the AIIB to work together with ADB. Under this kind of situation, this will push the AIIB to have a disclosure, yeah, in order a proper governance. So I really support about this global partnership, but I think excluding China will be something that probably is only sort of like sort of like push the tension between the so-called the U.S. and China.
Thank you, Chadri. Frederick, you want to add to any of these questions?
Yeah, well, first, I agree with both Francois and Babak Chatti about the points they make. One thing I add maybe at the margin, just as a nuance, that I think we need to be a bit careful sometimes dismissing some of China's policy moves as being entirely ideologically or state or party strength driven. And that is because if you look at, for example, the deflation of the real estate market, it is a very forceful policy. But then again, for over a decade, we've always highlighted the real estate market as essentially being in a bubble. So the deflation of the bubble in many ways is you could also characterize as prudent long-term policy because excesses were building up in that sector. You could also argue that the regulation of the tech sector, for example, is not entirely devoid of any pragmatic considerations. There has been extreme concentration of power among some companies. Small and medium-sized enterprises had reportedly suffered. And I would also argue that some of these policy priorities of regulating tech is something that is certainly being debated in the West as well. So that's just a nuance. I do recognize there is this struggle between pragmatism and ideology, or pragmatism and party building, however we want to define this. But in many ways, China has some long-term policy considerations here as well. With moving to Southeast Asia, I would argue that many state enterprises are also moving to Southeast Asia, so it's not just private companies. So I wouldn't characterize it as an escape from the state. I think it is they're looking for economic opportunities here. On infrastructure, generally, I do think that in many ways, the West had dropped the ball for a while here by reducing development financing for infrastructure, and that China essentially pushed into an area where the West had kind of neglected for quite some time to offer financing. And now what you see essentially the West catching up to China's presence, waking up to China's influence. And ultimately, from some countries, that is positive, of course, as long as we can ensure a certain degree of governance standards coming through. I do think that some economies emerge as winners here because they can draw on the financing from both China and Western-led institutions. And I think Southeast Asia is among the beneficiaries here from that almost geopolitical rivalry, if you want to term it as that, in terms of the economic implications, the investment that's coming into some of these economies.
Thank you, Frederick. It's such a pity I need to moderate because I have so many things I would add. I'm only going to say that on this issue of infrastructure. We need to realize that China is no longer there. It's no longer there. If you look at the data, China's official ODI, so official development assistance during the last 2 years has been 0. And we actually have a blog and a session at Bruegel with Ake Freeman going into details. If you look at cross-border lending to the rest of the world, other than trade finance, is basically 0. So, in a way, I'm sorry to say that it's actually a good thing that others are coming with initiatives, including Europe, the Global Gateway. I wish it were faster, though. Japan is coming now with a big plan for Africa. And I wouldn't actually say this is just to counter the BRI. I would actually say it's to counter the impact of a non-existent BRI, which is very different. Because if China were there, big and strong, all of these statements would probably be, as I said, you know, in a way counterproductive, because it would have to be through cooperation. But the issue is that China might not be there for a long time because China has its own issues. And policy banks in China are now putting all of their money inside China to solve banking issues, to solve chip industry issues and others. So that's a little bit what I wanted to add. So on that note, we have 3 questions and quite a few here. So because speakers are so well informed and they want to answer every question, I'm going to take the 3 and then we'll get them choose 4. Actually, so let's rush through this, and then I'll add the 3 questions online. So, mics, please. There's 1 here and 3 over there. Yeah. Please introduce yourself, if you may. Yeah, thank you.
Alicia, you know that I have been working on China and the IMF since China joined in 1980, the IMF, and I've been there many, many times and discussed with very high level of Chinese authorities, and ever since I have been going back. And what I have learned is that China's growth is based on 3 pillars, or China's thinking. Growth, to lift up the level of standard of living, reform, because you need reforms for that, and stability, because you need stability for both of those. My question is the following. Why do people think now that the pendulum has gone toward stability, which sometimes it's called ideology, but toward stability? What are the sources that the authorities believe that now there are dangers of instability? And I have 2 thoughts about that might be, but one is geopolitical, in the new world. The other one is some internal development, which I don't know. So if you could answer that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, if you don't mind, because I have 5 minutes left to answer questions that we've not even received yet. So this means we need to rush. Thank you. Yeah.
Short one. Have you any comment on rumors saying that ABD might think of cutting credits to China? Thank you. Maybe. Thank you to infirm or confirm.
Thank you. Frederick didn't mention climate change as a risk, and I was wondering why.
Yeah. By the way, I add, because it's exactly your question, there's a question from the audience on the energy situation and whether prospects from COP26 from Asian economies, not only China, are now look gloomier now than they were before. So, yeah. Next question, please. We'll take them all because that's all the time we have available.
Thank you. I'm on the Japanese mission to the EU. I basically work in the Ministry of Finance. So first of all, I would like to share the information. So regarding the financial or economic security or vulnerability, so the Asian crisis in 1998, the Asian financial crisis occurred. Since then, we have the ASEAN +3 financial cooperation. there's a mutual cooperation. There's a plus 3, including the Korea, China, Japan. So this scheme is similar to the ESM mechanism. They showed some the liquidity covered, and then recently the Paris Club or London Club. In case of the Paris Club, is the public debt restructuring this scheme. The London Club is the private debt structure system. So on the other hand, recently the G20 that is we are discussing now, China is over the debt to the developing country. By example, the Sri Lanka, African country, the Ethiopia, etc. So, the Paris Club member is the G7 countries and the others. So, the China is not a member. So, there are no this debt restructuring scheme. So, we are required to discuss and to complete this the scheme. So, for the approach to the financial stability. So, what do you think? What do you think there's about the complete this new financial debt restructuring scheme? That's
Thank you, thank you. So, I think there's time for one more. No more questions. That would be great. But I think I saw one hand there. Maybe they feel, yeah, over time. Sorry.
A very quick question, Nicolas Potier from Bruegel. Basically, almost the same question. We see now debt problems in countries like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, BRI recipients. Yeah. What role does China play in the debt restructuring process? Are they constructive or?
Similar question, yeah, indeed. Okay, so, and to add, if you, I think one more here is, yeah, it's basically about energy situation. I think we said we would touch upon the energy situation in Asia. So you have, actually, because we're out of time, each of you could take one question, and those who, if your questions weren't too interesting, I'm afraid that they will be skipped. I'm kidding, but that's all we have time for.
Am I supposed to
Françoise,
talk
always
first?
ladies first.
Okay. Well, perhaps on China and the various pillars of growth, well, I tend to agree with you that it used to be the case that growth was supposed to raise standard of living, to ensure, to make reform possible and to ensure stability. And precisely, I think that there is a rethink of these convictions. And so there may be internal discussion, actually, within China about this. And everybody is not on the same line as apparently Xi Jinping, who so far is imposing his own views. But I think that there is, a rethinking of the software. So the 3 pillars are no longer totally valid today. That's my own reading. But I may be wrong, and if Xi Jinping does not prevail, perhaps we will be back to these standard pillars.
Thank you. Who wants to start? Frederic and Chatip?
Okay. Okay, let me take the question regarding the climate change. I think this is a very important issue because with this geopolitical tension, and I can see that the commitment towards this net zero emission will be affected by this because related to the commitment for the financing. We are talking about the possibility of some people estimate about 6% of the global GDP. Yeah, and the latest number from Amar Bhattacharya talking about 3% of the global GDP. Regardless the number, we need a huge amount of money. And then the question is about the commitment under this kind of the geopolitical tension. That will be a big issue. That's on the supply side. On the demand side, many Asian countries need to improve their project preparation because some investors would like to invest, but they need to find the projects will be investable, potentially bankable. And not all of the Asian countries have this capacity in order to implement this, the renewable energy which is bankable. So without addressing this issue, the commitment of this net zero mission will be at risk.
That's great. Frédéric, last word.
Yeah. Yes, I think one of the questioners mentioned that I didn't highlight climate change, and let me just be very clear. When it comes to the headwinds that I mentioned for China, I purely discussed the cyclical headwinds. If we look at the structural, the underlying big long-term headwinds, climate change is absolutely up there, as is demographics, as is social stability, and that's actually for all of Asia. These are issues, certainly inequality and climate change. And those rank among the number one, I think, challenges we face in our time. So let me be absolutely clear here. I do think inequality and climate change are absolutely key. But my remarks were focused on the next few quarters from a cyclical perspective, which matters when we think about global inflation and just this near-term cyclical outlook for growth.
Thank you. Just 1 second on, because there were 2 questions on debt restructuring. And I want to highlight that because Chatrip is here and representing somehow the G20. I think this question needs to be tackled. I know it's tricky. We didn't get it in Italy, unfortunately. We had the DSSI basically die out without a solution. And I think Sri Lanka's case has shown how costly it is not to have a framework. And I think Europe, as a big creditor, needs to step up and continue to make proposals to accommodate new creditors in solutions so that the process doesn't get stuck, as in the case of Sri Lanka. So I hope that that helps, and we've answered most of the questions, but you can, of course, get hold of some of us during a coffee break. And I want to thank Frédéric and Chatrip and, of course, Françoise for being here today, and the audience for the wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.